So I'm Nancy Lunzer, and I'm a farmer. And I also have a job, but I'm primarily a farmer. I've been a farmer for about 30 years. How many of you are farmers? Okay, good. A lot of young people. That's good. Average age of a farmer is 58 years old, so we need young people to take over for it. So I wrote 2 grants. I had invasive species buckthorn, reed canary grass on the river, as well as non-invasive species, but it invades your pastures, prickly ash. So that was what we were targeting with these grants. I also fed grocery store waste to the hogs, which was very fun to do because then I could throw the food in the buckthorn thickets and they would dig up the food in the buckthorn at the same time. So, so my goals in the project, so my land is clay. We get a lot of rain. It's not like I can drive the tractor or the bobcat out most of the year because I'll be stuck. So it's not something that would be easy to go in and take out the buckthorn with the bobcat. We thought about it, but you just can't do it. It's that thick and hard to get out. So what we did was we put in hogs, and you can see the buckthorn in the background. Maybe you have buckthorn on your land, you know that the green in the background, all the leaves are off all the native vegetation. That's the buckthorn problem. The area in the front is what the hogs took out, and the area that was where the hogs removed the buckthorn never came back. So it was very beneficial to the land there, and I used it for pastures. As you can see, I have it fenced, and I've got a couple Berkshires in the back there working on the next. So there was 10 acres of buckthorn. So I contacted the DNR, and I got a forest management plan for them, and they said, you've got buckthorn, and here's what you need to do. You bulldoze the 10 acres, and then go back in every year for 5 years and slather on as much diesel fuel mixed with herbicide on each stump that's going to be growing back, and you do that for 5 years, and then you'll be able to get rid of the buckthorn. And I was like, yeah, right, you know. I just bought 40 acres of woods, I don't want to take it out. So that was, my plan was to do it with the hogs and not with chemicals and machinery. However, hogs can only do a small amount at a time, and I only had a few hogs, so I was buying feeder pigs in the spring and then running them on the land until the fall. So that's what I ended up doing. So my goal was to allow the hogs to root, because most people who have hogs ring them so they can't root. I wanted to use that natural ability to take out the invasive species. I followed up with sheep. And the sheep on this picture are taking out some prickly ash. I would cut the prickly ash thickets. You can see they're really tall. They were taking over the pasture. I'd cut, 50 stalks in the morning, and the sheep would come in and take all the leaves off of them. And it's really easy to get rid of prickly ash. If it gets grazed a couple of times, it'll be dead. Buckthorn's not the same way. Buckthorn, you would have to graze the rest of your life probably to kill it, unless you dig it out with hogs. The other thing we had was reed canary grass. The reed canary grass and buckthorn is on every riverway in Minnesota. Reed canary grass is a shallow-rooted plant that basically grows so fast that the native species can't get a root in. And that's what we have here. You can't even hardly see the stream bank here. It's shallow-rooted so that when you get a flood, which you do every spring, it undercuts the banks and it has more erosion. So my goal was to get rid of the reed canary grass too. The whole property runs downhill into the ponds. You have several different ponds with lots of wildlife in them. The woods is full of frogs and toads, so I didn't want to put a lot of chemicals out there. And so we wanted to keep this from leaching into our ponds. And then we wanted to protect the trees. You can see there's a lot of trees in the area where the buckthorn is. There's the oaks, but there was a lot of old aspen that were dying out, creating a great spot for buckthorn to grow. And we already had a middle story of buckthorn, as you saw in the first picture, to the point where native species were not able to get ahead of the buckthorn. The buckthorn was shading them out. We did go in and we took out some of the aspens that were dying in order to get into some of the areas just to clean it up. Most of the area is full of milkweed. We try to keep milkweed. Sheep eat milkweed, so we had to be careful to let the butterflies develop and then put the sheep in there in the fall. So we would run horses on some of the pastures to save the milkweed, because horses don't eat milkweed. And then we wanted to control the regrowth. We knew there'd be regrowth. We kind of wondered if we put the hogs in there, if they were going to bury the berries and create a flush of new buckthorn. That did not happen. We don't know why. There's more research to do on this, so write your grants. And then we wanted to improve the forage. We had a couple areas, buckthorn thickets and prickly ash thickets that, there's nothing growing underneath it at all, and it wasn't going to feed your stock, and so we wanted to clean it up a little bit. It was also about $500 an acre for the first year, not including the labor, to get the buckthorn out if you had somebody else do it. So that was an issue too. And my husband was like, well, let's just leave the buckthorn there. Oh, we can't do that, So, and we had a lot of the areas of the woods, it's just beautiful woodland, and it grows tons of wildflowers, there's lots of wildlife in it, and we wanted to save those areas and not ruin them, and then hopefully the areas that we cleaned up would go back to this growth. This is a picture of some areas that came back very nicely with some trout lily in the spring. Okay, so our machinery couldn't go into this area. It's too, I don't know if you guys have clay ground, but it never dries out, so you just can't get machinery in there very well. All right, so send in the hogs. We also had a lot of rocks, and we also wanted to save our large trees. If you go in with machinery, some trees can't take compaction on their roots, so this is what a hog can do. They can turn over all the soil and not compact it. They can dig underneath the root ball. So I don't know, the other thing they told me was what you can do is you can uproot the buckthorn with a weed wrench, which is a really good idea. I have a weed wrench, it works really well. However, buckthorn grows close enough together that the roots intermesh, so you're not pulling one, you're pulling, there's 10 stems around it. So what the hogs do is they eat all the vegetation first, everything easy. They go in and eat all the vegetation. Then they start rooting in for the roots. And so you see that they've gone, you can see most of the lower vegetation is gone. They're starting to root down underneath that stuff. The problem with hogs is that they also eat everything else too, so you don't save anything. They do eat poison ivy, which was nice. We had a lot of poison ivy in there. We were feeding grocery store waste, and we found they would not eat the commercial produced soybean meal and corn that we were buying. They wouldn't touch it. Once they got the grocery store waste, they didn't want anything to do with corn and soybean meal. You want to teach your hogs to jump back from the fence when they touch it. So the best thing to do is get them in with a permanent fence, put a wire down around the bottom, put your hogs in there. They'll learn pretty fast to stay off the fence. The problem with that then is they won't pull the buckthorn by the fence because they're afraid of it. So here's an area of buckthorn that I was going to just fence. I used polydome huts for the hogs to live in. So I'd move that into an area, and then I fenced it with, I used Premier 1. They have really good fencing. It's a little more sturdy. I used their Pig Quick fence. I loved it. I could step over it to go put their food out there. I could step back over it to get out. It was easy. I could fence anything. I could fence around a corner. I could drag it in through the woods. So it was really easy to use. I used, for hogs, they're really easy to use with an electric fence because they're heavy and their feet go into the soil really well. Sheep and goats, not so much. So I was able to use this little fencer, I don't know if I have a picture of it, mounted right on its own ground rod and hooked to the fence, and then I could just move all that. And so and it was easy for me to install. If you guys have used the new ElectroWeb fence, you don't have to have permanent fencing anymore and all the corner posts and all that stuff. You can go in and do this kind of fence. You can fence any area and you can move it really easily. And then if your grass is growing up around the fence, you can just move it over to the graze part very easily. It's easy to do. It's lightweight, so I could handle it myself. And then when I got out into remote areas, especially with the sheep, I was grazing some pastures that were pretty far out. Then I had to go to a little stronger fencer, and so I used a deep cycle battery and a 12-volt solar panel. If you get bigger than a 12-volt panel, you got to have the regulator with it too. If you stay under 12 volts, you don't have to. Sheep are pretty easy to fence if they have enough food, which I guess is the same for most animals. So this is one day. I'm putting the hogs in there for one day, and I did a small area. So what I wanted to do was completely move them out of the area when they were done. Now, The smaller piglets could not take out the bigger stems. So what I would do is let it get rained on for, a couple of times and then put them back in there as the hogs got older. I'd put them back in and take out whatever they didn't get the first time. And so you could see the chickens are in there eating the food waste too. And that's a great, hopefully we'll, in this country, it's against the law in Minnesota to feed hogs garbage. Okay? So what's garbage, right? If the grocery store throws it away, is it garbage? So we went and picked up food every day, and we didn't feel it was garbage. It's actually pretty fresh. Not that everything was perfectly fresh. We would throw that out and compost it. But if it was fresh, we'd throw it to the hogs, and the chickens went and figured that out pretty fast. So then, wherever they were being fed and wherever they were living, that would get trampled faster and dug up faster. And so then we'd just take out the feeders and move it out into the buckthorn a little bit further, and then that area would get cleaned out. So larger hogs for larger buckthorn. All right. So just like any animal, I guess, the longer you leave them on the ground, the more likely you're going to have parasites in that ground. So this was a really easy system because I could move the polydome and I could move the fence and I could move the water, and everything went along with the hogs. So I ended up not having problems with odors, and you know what hogs do? They make a big wallow when it rains, and then they live in that for a few days and they don't do anything else. So if you move them off of there, then they got to create a new wallow for themselves. And so I moved the hogs completely, so I didn't have any problem with the parasites, although hogs have a parasite that is in earthworms. They love earthworms, so you have to be aware of that. It's a lungworm. It doesn't affect hogs when they're young to the, they're usually grown by 5 months. So it doesn't affect them by that time, but if you were keeping sows or something, you'd have to be aware of that. So the amount of area that a hog could take out depended how wet the ground was and what the temperature was. They don't work very hard when it's 100 degrees out and humid. And also the size of the plants. So, people always ask me, well, how many acres could you do with the hog? Well, that depended on the weather, depended on the moisture in the soil. We have really wet soil, so they really like that. And then I said we re-grazed areas. So they would go through an area and take out everything that was easy. We'd take them off that area, move them to another area. After a couple weeks of rain, the hogs were getting a little bit bigger, put them back in that area. Now they would target the stuff that they missed because there was nothing else to eat anymore. So it hasn't grown back. So they'll have their dunging areas. Hogs are very clean animals. People don't think of them that way, but they're very clean animals. We never had to replace the bedding. They don't soil in their own homes, but they will not dig in their dunging areas. So then if they're dunging in the buckthorn thickets, you have to let it get rained on and put them back in there later. Dig less when the soil is dry. They dig in the easiest places first. They don't go into the thickest part of the thicket. So then having the grocery store waste was nice because we'd get 30 cases of peaches, throw all the peaches into the buckthorn, and then they'd go in there. And hogs are kind of interesting because, so you've got this beautiful ripe peach, right? So they would go and squash the peach and eat the nut. And they later ate the fruit, but that wasn't what they were going for. They won't dig near the electric fence. But sometimes they would push dirt up onto the wire, and on the pig quick fence, the lower wire is hot. So they would push dirt up onto the wire, so you'd have to kind of watch for that and just pick the fence up and set it back down again. We did use a polar bear, so you didn't get all areas. But the beauty of the hogs, different from the sheep, when you cut brush for the sheep, then there's so much debris that they can't get back into to graze very easily. Not so with hogs. They break up everything. They bust it, they trample it, they break it up, and you can see that all this sticks and stuff in there are ready to plant. So we did use shade grass. I don't think I would do shade grass again. Number one, it was expensive, and number two, it wasn't native to the area. And shade grass isn't something that you're gonna get much grazing out of. People graze under forests all the time, but you're probably gonna graze it once a year. That's not a lot of forage. So what I would do in the future is I would not plant it to grass, just let the native species come back in, and they will. So we had a lot of native species coming back in. And in this case, I put down seed. We had a really, really dry summer. And then we used the old bedding instead of moving it with a house. We just put new bedding in. But we'd take the old bedding and mulch with it. So that was the shade mix that I used. Again, nothing was native. We had a little trouble finding native grass. I know that they're out there, and we did find a place that, but it was a little bit prohibitive because they were the only ones doing it, and they had good plants. Anyway, so it was really dry that summer and fall. And we had no rain in the forecast, so we did a lot of frost seeding. Frost seeding worked the best. So this is an area that was frost seeded onto the snowpack. So we went out there, you know, late March, sprinkled seeds, and we got a great growth out of it. And that was, and then some native species came up through that too in the spring. All right, so you don't get a lot of grazing off your shade grass, but we did bring in sheep then afterwards to go in and take it off. It's you know, the continuous cutting method is basically what you're doing. You're trying to keep all the leaves off the buckthorn, right down to the ground. So you're going to re-graze it all the time, and which is not great for the sheep because they can then get parasites because they're grazing down to the ground. But you've got to keep the, if buckthorn has a leaf on it, it'll grow. It'll continue. So what we learned though is that, so then that's a picture of the shade grass in the front and then the buckthorn to be taken out later in the back. Okay, so again, going in with the sheep, this is the regrowth after the first year, going in with the sheep to take out any buckthorn was there, and they took out everything else too. But they kept the buckthorn from getting reestablished. And when we originally went in there, we have a lot of burrs in our area, a lot of burrs on the pasture, a lot of burrs in the woods, so we didn't want to use wool sheep. I don't think they would have fared very well on that. So we use hair sheep. They shed in the spring. You don't have to, they're naturally polled. You don't have to dock their tails, so it's an easy animal to raise. They're somewhat resistant to external parasites and internal parasites, but that being said, if you have an animal walking in its own manure, they're not going to be resistant anymore. So, you know, eventually they're going to be walking in their own manure unless you have an unlimited amount of land. And so to say that an animal is parasite resistant, I just don't agree that that's the case if you're having in a confinement setting, and let's face it, most farms have a barn and a water, and that's where they're going to have their manure. So, but they're supposedly, I've had some that are 8 or 10 years old now, and they seem to be more resistant than others, like to keep their daughters. But the cool thing about buckthorn is the sheep went and ate them first. They ignored the native species, they went and ate the buckthorn first. But they couldn't reach it all, so I had to go out and cut it. So you got to cut it so that they can reach it, otherwise you'll get this buckthorn stalk with a beautiful bushy top on it. So they also eat everything else. So if you have native, oh, 5 minutes, I'll hurry. Okay. So once it's, you know, once they graze it off, you're going to re-graze it. And that was the most effective thing. So when I cut the buckthorn, originally when I went out there, I cut it really short, 6 inches high, right? Because I wanted to get rid of the darn thing. Well, that didn't kill it very well. But if I left it about 30 inches high, which is a lot easier to cut with my lopper, it would die almost immediately. Okay, but the next year, after being grazed off for a full year, you may get some growth out of the base of it, you know, because that's how buckthorn is. But when you left that tall stalk, it seemed to limit its growth from that point on, and actually it would get mushrooms on the stems. If I took the plant, and it was maybe a ½ inch or 3/4 of an inch, and bent it over, it killed it faster. Because the cambium was still intact, they grazed off all the leaves on it. Then it had to keep not just the 30-inch stump, but the whole thing alive. And that killed it even faster, so that worked the best, and I think more research needs to be done on that. But if I cut it at the base, this is what happened. It would grow this beautiful plant. It was so green and leafy. It's so good to see. And then you would end up sometimes having so much debris around it they couldn't get in and re-graze it. And then here's some that are broken over, and you can see that they're dead in the woods, and that was... So again, the hogs dig up everything, so you're not going to save your young plants of any other things. And animals graze they go out and they're selective and they graze from the barn on out. So they start grazing and then they graze all the way out. So my vet tells me, you know, don't let them graze any short grass. That's great, but when they are taking off from wherever they slept that night, they're going to graze on their way out, and that's going to be the shortest grass. So never graze below 4 inches. Yeah, that's kind of hard to do because you've got areas that are going to graze shorter, and then you're going to have areas in the back of the pasture that they're going to have too long. And that's just the beauty of it. So we use horses to pick up sheep worms. So every time we put the sheep on the pasture, we put the horses on the next time, and then we were hoping that they would pick up worm eggs. Horses don't have the same worm eggs as, or worm species as sheep. And then we had, you know, our pastures were much improved because none of the broadleafs could live anymore. All right. So sheep, they like broadleafs. They prefer them. Horses, they like grass. So it actually improves the horse pastures. The hogged off areas had the best control of buckthorn. Didn't come back, didn't plant the berries like we expected them to do, and it hasn't grown buckthorn yet. All those areas are completely wiped. There's no buckthorn in it. So it's a great way to get them out of there. Sheep aren't the same. Buckthorn keeps coming back. It's not getting all the leaves off every grazing, and so you end up, but they're still on those pastures and they'll take care of it eventually. The hogs dug it up till it was bare dirt, so you're going to have more erosion. Our land's pretty flat, but still, when we get these heavy rains, you get more erosion. So hogs aren't great if you have a hilly area. And brush is a great feed for sheep, so you're better off feeding sheep brush than you are actually feeding them on grass. All right, reed canary grass. We tried to get the sheep to go in there. They wouldn't go in there. They won't touch it once it gets mature. The horses went in there. Horses are like this. They're selective grazers. They'll go in the spring, and they completely wiped out the reed canary grass on the edges of the river. And native species started to come in right away. But you've got to get the mat down in order to get the native species to take root. And this is kind of an area that's fenced off from them. You can see that they've taken down a lot of let the native species come. So we saved on hay, we grazed well into the winter, and as a result of the research that I did, the DNR decided to reimburse people for using livestock instead of chemicals to get rid of buckthorn. So it was a big change in the state program, and they were very involved in it too. So that's it.